Hi there. So in this video, I'm going to show you the ability to to automatically create unit tests. Or unit test is not actually the correct words, so we are referring to these as assumptions. You can find them underneath MISC here. When you create your cloudlet, you don't have any assumptions. We have a bunch of assumptions internally in Magic, which we are executing before we are creating new releases. Now, you might want to do the same thing with your modules. For instance, if we now go to tools, we go to endpoints and we filter on status, then you remember this one from our CRM system that we created earlier. We had all of these status fields. Now, if this is a fairly static list of potentially status fields, then you might actually also create an assumption that assumes the return response from the server too. However, the way you want to create a new assumption is simply click assumptions. And at this point, we can write crm.status.get, for instance, and we can verify that the status fields are correctly returned. Now, if you have a bunch of business logic in the actual Hyperlambda file, which you of course might have if you manually add Hyperlambda to the CRUD generated result after the CRUD generator have done its thing, then obviously things might go over time. Errors might seep into your code base, resulting in that the endpoint don't work anymore. For this particular endpoint, for instance, typically the statuses are fairly static, right? Once the system is set into production and they have chosen a bunch of status fields for their accounts, such as lead, client, partner, etc., then the content of that database table is probably rarely, if ever, going to actually change. So you can actually turn on match response here, which was what I was hinting towards a minute ago. Now, when I click save, I actually have a unit test. I can now go to my MISC here. I can click on assumptions and I can execute every single unit test I have sequentially in just like by clicking one button. I can keep on doing this with other endpoints. If we find, for instance, the other status field, remember we had two CRM systems here. We had this guy too, which also returns a JSON payload. We can create a new assumption for this, and this one we can call ista-crm.status.get, for instance, verifies that the status content is correct. If you have a database that, for this one, we probably want to do match response, but if you have a database table that typically changes over time, such as our accounts get endpoint here, right? This is probably going to change over time. So at this point, when we are creating our new assumption, we want to write crm.accounts. Probably you can really name it whatever you want to, but it's probably smart to use like some sort of like semantic naming convention here. Verifies that the accounts get endpoint returns something and does not trigger an HTTP error status code, for instance. At this point, we don't want to match the response. Why? Because if we are inserting a new account later down the road, then the assumption is actually going to fail. So now we can save it. And as you can see now, we are basically very rapidly generating a bunch of assumptions that we can easily execute. You can have hundreds of these in a more complex system that you can just rapidly execute in like, by clicking a single button, and then that sanity checks the entirety of your system. So these are assumptions. Now, just to repeat, you go to endpoints, you invoke the endpoint. You can invoke the ping endpoint here, for instance, invoke. Then you create a new assumption here. Now maybe we want to do system.ping.get, verifies ping works, match response, save, and we now have a new assumption here for the ping endpoint too. So this is an extremely rapid way of automating a large part of the things that are typically manually required to be created as you are creating unit tests. So basically, you could argue that we have automation on the creation of unit tests. Although technically they're not unit tests, they're more like integration tests. However, it doesn't matter, they solve the same problem.